Me Too movement. Please welcome Dr. Robert.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. When I poked my head in, I saw so many faces, and I know that students have busy schedules. Coming to a lecture that's not part of a course is often difficult, and I felt, frankly, kind of proud of myself that all these people, and then I looked around and saw the free food, and then I said, oh, that's why. That makes sense. I would have come for the free food too, even. Anyway, thanks everybody for the invitation to get out of Austin for a day. It's always nice to get out of Austin now and then, especially on the heels of South by Southwest, and escape a bit. So I'm really grateful to be here. I'm going to launch right into today's subject, which is about a feminist critique of pornography in the context of the Me Too movement and the focus on sexual violence and harassment that's been emerging in recent years. In the course of that, I'm going to talk about things like patriarchy, institutionalized male domination of women, white supremacy, these other systems of power. And you might notice that I will be doing that as a white guy, retired university professor, somebody who, in the way these things shake out, came out on top of most of the domination, subordination dynamics in the world. Right? I was born male in a male supremacist world, born white in a white supremacist world. I had adequate education and economic opportunities in a highly unequal economy. I was born and raised in the US, in a world dominated by the US. As a friend of mine used to always say, Jensen, if you had been born good looking, you would have had it all. Which is a way of starting by recognizing that I am speaking from that position of unearned privilege and power about systems of domination and subordination. I always think of this as the irony of being me. I do this a lot. Right? So I always start by recognizing that, and usually professors and writers don't say this a lot, but I'm going to make this claim. I can guarantee you there's not a single original idea in anything I'm about to say. Right? Usually professors and writers want to be thought of as big original thinkers. I've got nothing original to tell you. I'm going to offer some ways of thinking about the world that come from feminism primarily. I am following behind a lot of women who have, over years, both in intellectual and political terms, sketched out this critique and then tried to bring it forward in the world. So I'm under no illusions that I'm the big smart guy up here saying new and original things. In fact, many of you in the room will have a better understanding of some of what I'm saying, even if you've never studied it, just by living some of this. So I want to make that clear. That said, I hope I'm not going to waste your time. I have been thinking about these questions for 30 years and using feminist frameworks and other critical frameworks to try and understand them. And if nothing else, I might offer a kind of language that's helpful in trying to go forward and talk about things that are so difficult. And if nothing else, if you're not white or if you're a woman and you're tired of arguing with people who look like me because people won't take you seriously, you can always just say, well, I saw a white guy who said this, therefore it must be true. So you can use me any way you like. Okay. I'm going to start off just making one observation about the Me Too movement and the heightened attention to questions of men's violence against women and harassment both in schools and on the job and in life in general. We are talking about that now, but we have to remember there was a time when essentially the culture didn't talk about that. There was a time in my lifetime, I was born in 1958, when this conversation, as difficult as it is today, would have been impossible. Let's just use the example of sexual assault, of rape. There was a time in the United States when rape was seen as simply the pathological behavior of a very few aberrant men. Right? That rape didn't happen very often, but when it did, it was because you just had a few pathological guys who were somehow bent the wrong way. Right? Rape wasn't understood as a societal problem that went much deeper than that. It was individualized and psychologized in that sense. And therefore, if you wanted to deal with rape, you did it by thinking about either psychology or the criminal justice system. Well, the second wave of feminism, that part of the feminist movement that emerged in the 1960s, came along, and it made a lot of critiques and insights about American society, one of which was, I think, summarized in this statement. In the United States, not simply the United States, but we'll talk about the world we live in here. In the United States, rape is normal. The second wave of radical feminism helped us understand that rape is not the pathological act of a few aberrant men, it's normal. Now, by normal, we don't mean normal in the sense of a norm we want to uphold. It's something that we strive for, not that kind of normal. What the feminist movement did was help us understand that men's violence against women, not just that which is legally labeled as rape, but the whole range of activities that are captured in terms like harassment and sexual violence, and a term I tend to use, just sexual intrusion. The various ways that women experience unwanted sexual contact and attention from men. That whole range of things, that's normal. It's normal in two ways. One is that it happens to women on such a regular basis that we cannot treat it as abnormal. It is the normal experience of women in the culture. The other way it's normal, it is the predictable consequence of the way we socialize boys and men into their understanding of what it is to be a man in relationship to women. It's normal socialization. Right? That doesn't mean every man engages in activity that meets the legal definition of rape. It means that men and boys are socialized in an understanding of male, female, sex, gender, power that makes rape inevitable. Right? Rape is normal. The radical feminist movement, one particular wing of that second wave of feminism, helped us understand that rape is normal. And out of that came rape crisis centers, domestic violence shelters, 24-hour hotlines, everything that we now take for granted to deal with the social problem of men's violence. None of that existed when I was born. It exists now because of feminism, and particularly because of the wing of feminism we often call radical feminism, which focused on men's violence as one of the key ways that men assert dominance and control women. Okay. Why go through that history? Because there would be no Me Too movement without that radical feminist analysis of men's violence. Right? And we are often shy about naming it in that way. It's hard enough just to talk about these issues, but to start to talk about the deeply patriarchal nature of contemporary society, the way men and boys are still socialized today to think about male, female, sex, power, gender, right, is all the more difficult. So why am I bringing that up to talk about pornography? Because many of those same women who offered us this insight into the nature of men's violence also looked around at the culture and said, where are the cultural support systems that allow this to continue? And in a mass-mediated world, not surprisingly, those women often looked at media. And if you go back to the 70s and the 80s, for those who are old enough to remember the development of feminist media criticism, we saw feminist criticism of all of those media forms. There were feminist critiques of Hollywood movies, of network television, of women's magazines, of advertising. Right? Many of you are probably familiar with some of those critiques today. You've engaged in them, taught them, read about them. Okay. In addition to all that critique of what we might call mainstream media, there was also a critique of pornography that emerged. This was largely the work of a woman named Andrea Dworkin, who sadly is no longer with us, but her writing lives on. In fact, there's a new collection of Andrea's work that just came out this past month that I would highly recommend. Andrea looked around and said, okay, the growing pornography market is part of this mediated world. What are the messages about male, female, sex, gender, power that we see in pornography? And she really pioneered this work. Came out in 1979 in a book called Pornography, Men Possessing Women. And all of the work that I've done in the 30 years I've been paying attention to this issue really wouldn't exist without Andrea's work. That's why I say there's really nothing original. You should read my books. They're compelling, incredibly well written, deeply insightful. But if you're only going to read one book about this subject, it ain't mine. Right? So Andrea's work is really central to this. Right? And if you were to take all of Andrea's work on pornography and reduce it to kind of a bumper sticker, right, what was she arguing? Right? She was arguing that pornography is not just sex on film. Because that's what a lot of people say. When you offer a critique of pornography, you'll often get very learned response that goes something like this. Well, you know, people have sex, and pornography is just sex on film, so what's the big deal? Maybe not a completely fair summary of the critique, but that is often what people will say, yes? If you have a critique of pornography, you must have a problem with sex, because all pornography is sex on film. And what Andrea pointed out is pornography is not just sex on film. Pornography is sex in the context of male domination and female subordination. Pornography is sex eroticized in a domination-subordination context. It is sexual inequality made erotic in film. And by analyzing the pornography that was available when she wrote that book in the 1970s, she was able to see these dynamics. That the fundamental dynamic of pornography was domination and subordination sexualized, not simply sex on film. Right? Now, she pointed out that the primary domination-subordination dynamic in the bulk of pornography, which is the heterosexual pornography market, and that's the kind of material I'll be talking about today. There's a wide variety of pornographic materials in the world today, obviously, but the bulk of it is heterosexual. That is, it is depicting primarily heterosexual sex for a primarily heterosexual male audience. Right? In that heterosexual porn market, Andrea pointed out it was not just male domination and female subordination that was sexualized, it was every other power dynamic imaginable, primarily and importantly racial dynamics. Right? Andrea saw that in the material that was being produced in the 1970s. Fast forward to today, everything Andrea said is even more accurate today. Her analysis is even more compelling today. Yet, her analysis is largely marginalized, not part of the common discourse, not only in the dominant culture. It's not just that the culture doesn't want to hear what Andrea had to say, but if you go into contemporary feminism, into women's studies, you will also find that that analysis is largely ignored or marginalized. And I'm here to suggest we should take it seriously. In fact, I'm here to say that Andrea's analysis, which was of course then magnified and carried forward by many other women over time, right, is more compelling today than it was when she first articulated it. It's more important today because, in fact, the pornography industry went in exactly the direction you would have predicted from Andrea's work. And an analysis that is more compelling today, yet more marginal today, leads to an obvious question: why? If there's a perspective out there, a theory, a way to think about the world that helps us understand the world, why is it so routinely ignored? And to cut to the conclusion, I think we're going to find the answer is fear. The culture's fear in confronting any of this. All right. Now, I've made the case, or I've made the assertion that pornography is the domination-subordination dynamic sexualized, not only in the sex-gender category, but across the board. Right? How am I going to demonstrate that? Right? You shouldn't just accept it. Right? We're good critical. This is a sociology department, right? Critical thinking. Do sociologists accept anything as no? The heart and soul of the modern university is the sociology department. It is where the best thinking is being done on any university campus. Yeah. I was in a communications department last week. I said the same thing to them. You have to play to the crowd at some point. Come on. No, but seriously, sociology is where we do this. Okay. Well, first of all, you'll see the screen is not on behind me. I'm not going to show you any images. There could be an illustrated lecture about the domination-subordination dynamic as it plays out in pornography, but I don't use images for two reasons. One is I don't think it's responsible to put more pornography out in the world, even though it does help make the point. And second is because I cannot take it anymore. I've been working on this issue for 30 years, and I reached my emotional limit about 10 years ago, and I simply cannot do it anymore. Right? I have a lot of admiration for people who keep trying to make the argument and doing new research, but I can't. I do keep up with the research. I have a lot of colleagues, friends working on this. And what I'm about to tell you is based on my own work from now a decade ago, but I can guarantee you it holds. Okay. So I'm not going to show you any images, but I am going to speak bluntly for a little bit. I'm not going to go on in great detail, but I do want to say that even talking about the images in pornography can feel overwhelming, even if you're not looking at the images. So I apologize in advance. I'll keep it rather clinical and brief, but I don't think we can talk about pornography in the abstract without talking about the images. Okay. Now, to do this, I have to talk about some terms that come out of the pornography industry. And again, I'm not talking about every pornographic image ever produced. I'm talking about the dominant part of the pornography industry, the for-profit industry that is generating enormous revenues from this, which is primarily heterosexual for a primarily heterosexual male audience. And by that, I'm going to repeat, I'm not saying there are no women who watch pornography. I'm not saying that there's no pornography that comes out of gay and lesbian community. There is sexualized imagery about everything you can imagine in the world. Right? But we're looking at patterns, because we're in a sociology department, and that's what sociologists do. We're not psychologists. We're not focusing on the individual. We're looking at patterns across society. Okay? Right. So the heterosexual porn market, the heterosexual porn industry talks about basically two types of films. Right? One is what are called features, and the other is what are called gonzo porn films. Now, some of this has changed when the world went digital and porn moved completely online, but these two categories still hold. Features are films the pornography industry produces that sort of roughly mimic the structure of a Hollywood movie. You know, a kind of three-act structure with characters, dialogue. You know, the plot line may be a bit thin, the music may be cheesy, but there is something that looks like what we would call a movie. Those are features. The features tend to be the tamer porn. Often they're produced for what is called the couples market, for films for men to watch in the presence of female partners. Right? The gonzo genre arose now more than 20 years ago, and that's where the action is in porn. That's the vast majority of porn films made, and it's where the porn industry traditionally would try out new kinds of sexual acts for pornographic films. Right? Gonzo is where you push the envelope to develop new kinds of sexual scenes in porn, because porn is like any other industry. You don't make money by remaining static. Right? You have to constantly, innovate is the term we use, and porn innovates in a sort of strange way. All right. So if you look at gonzo, you will see they abandon the traditional notion of a film with a story. Gonzo porn is just sex for consumption. Right? There's no pretense of a plot or characters. Typically, the camera operators or directors will speak to the performers from behind the camera. Right? The illusion of film is dispensed with. It's simply sex presented for primarily male sexual arousal and masturbation. That's pornography stripped down to its basics. Okay. What are the kinds of sexual scenes you will see in gonzo pornography? Well, I'm going to talk about 5 particular kinds of scenes that emerged over basically the last 20 years, which I think illustrate this domination-subordination dynamic that's at the heart of pornography. These are 5 trends in porn that I think you will find are specifically pornographic. They come out of the pornography world. They aren't sexual practices that are routinely and widely practiced in everyday life and then imported into pornography. They're generated in the porn world. Right? Right. So what are the 5 categories? This is where it does get a little crass. I apologize, but I'll move quickly through it. All right. These are, again, 5 types of sexual scenes in pornography that you will see routinely in gonzo pornography, right? And have also migrated into the features so that they're now pretty much defining of porn. Right? I'll list them all and then we'll go back over them. Right. The first is what is called a DP. DP is industry slang for a double penetration. The second is double vag, short for double vaginal. The third is double anal. The fourth is gagging. And the fifth is ATM, which does not stand for automated teller machine. We'll get to that in a minute. All right. DPs, double vag, double anal, gagging, ATM. These, again, are 5 sexual practices routine in pornography, started in gonzo, but have migrated into the vast flow of pornographic images widely available online and in other forms. What are they? A DP is a sexual scene in which a woman is penetrated vaginally and anally by 2 men at the same time. That is what the industry calls a DP. As I was saying that, I looked around and I saw several women wince for an obvious reason that might seem to you to be potentially quite painful, and in fact it is. Women in the industry talk about how they have to condition their bodies to be able to engage in that kind of sex for the camera. A double vag, it won't be hard to figure this out, is when a woman is penetrated by 2 men vaginally at the same time. A double anal is when a woman is penetrated by 2 men anally at the same time. There is something called a DVDA, double vag, double anal, where a woman would be penetrated by 4 men at the same time. I've interviewed porn directors and producers about these things, and I've never spoken to anyone who said they actually filmed a DVDA, although one guy said he heard about it, although the way you have to position the bodies, it wasn't 4 men, it was 3 men and a dildo. Right. Now, he spoke about that as if it was just kind of a technical problem of how do you arrange the bodies. Right. That's the way this is discussed in the porn industry. All right. Double penetration, double vag, double anal, gagging. Gagging are what they call all oral films in which the goal is to penetrate a woman orally so deeply and so roughly that she will gag. And there are films which actually lead to women vomiting after that treatment. There are many of these kinds of films, different companies producing all sorts of variations on it. The original one was called Gag Factor. And the last time I checked, which was several years ago, they were on Gag Factor number 47. I have no idea how many have been produced since then. The last one, ATM. ATM is industry slang for ass to mouth. An ass-to-mouth scene is a scene in which a man penetrates a woman anally, removes his penis, and without hygiene, at least no visible hygiene on the screen, places his penis into the mouth of that woman or another woman. Ass to mouth. Right? Now, in an edited film, we don't know what happens in real life as it's being filmed, but it's presented as directly ass to mouth. Okay. Now, that's it. No more description. Let's go back to Andrea, that pornography is not just sex on film, it's sex in the context of domination and subordination. I think you can see in these sexual practices, which are common in pornography, the compelling nature of Andrea's analysis. Let's take ass to mouth, which I want to point out is not in every porn film you will see, but is now routine in pornography. I'm not talking about some practice that you have to go meet some guy at the end of an alley and buy it out of the trunk of his car. If you were all online, which some of you are, you can find these films literally in seconds. Okay. It is not an aberration. It is the way the porn industry works. Okay. Is there any way to explain the concept of an ass-to-mouth film without recognizing the domination-subordination dynamic that's being eroticized? What added sexual pleasure can there be for a man in going from a woman's anus to her mouth? What added pleasure could there be from that practice except the humiliation that, as my co-author and longtime friend in this, Gail Dine, says, is literally making women eat shit? That is what an ass-to-mouth scene is. Okay. All right. The domination-subordination dynamic made sexual is the core of pornography. I mentioned that pornography not only sexualizes male domination, female subordination, but it sexualizes every other inequality that you can find in society, up to and including a genre, it's not a big genre, but a genre of disability porn, which uses women with physical disabilities. I can guarantee you, any relationship in which there is top and bottom, dominant and subordinate, any relationship in this world that you can imagine has been made into pornography already. Right? Now, the one that is most popular is what is called interracial porn. And this will be the last description of porn I talk about before we get into why. What is interracial porn? Interracial is the term they use in the porn industry. It's not my term. And basically, if a film is labeled interracial, what that means is there is somebody in this film who is not white. The porn industry is like the rest of the country, right? The default assumption of normal is white, yes? If something isn't coded racially, what do you assume it is? White, okay. So interracial porn signals to viewers there's somebody in this film who isn't white. Now, you will find every possible racial combination, almost every possible racial combination, sexualized in this interracial genre. You will find, in terms of the way women are presented, the hot-blooded Latina, yes, the stereotype of the highly sexualized Latina. Black women in this genre tend to be portrayed as particularly nasty, yeah, down and dirty, because the stereotype of black women sexually. Right? Asian women are typically presented as kind of the demure geisha girl stereotype. Right? All the most crass racist stereotypes that you can imagine exist in porn, in this category of interracial. But there is one particular pairing in interracial that is most common, and it's black men and white women. Black men and white women. The bulk of interracial porn pairs black men and white women. Now, the reason I keep saying that over and over again, because at first glance, that does not seem obvious. Because those of you who know the history of the sexualization of white supremacy, what was always, the great fear of white men in the sexual realm? It was black men defiling their pure white women, yes? We all know that in the history of lynching, there was a lot of lynching that was justified because of the threat that black men posed to the purity of white women. That was always a really good trick for white men because it allowed you to control the black population because they were a threat, and it allowed you to control white women as well. Right? So the obvious question is, in a country with that racial history, a country still struggling with white supremacy, why would there be so much pornography pairing black men and white women? Because the primary consumers of that interracial porn are white men. I've asked the people who, in the industry who make it, I say, so who buys, they call it black on white, right? Black men, white women. They said, oh, black on white, that's all white guys buying that. Black men don't like that. They said black men tend to like black on black or other thing, right? So you have to, it's counterintuitive. Why in a country with this racial history would white men be buying pornography that pairs black men and white women? Right? I struggled with this. I couldn't figure it out for the longest time. And my friend Gail, I think, is the person who first sort of understood this. If pornography is the domination-subordination dynamic sexualized, a way to sexually denigrate women especially, right? You have to keep finding new ways to do it. Right? And there's only so many ways you can position the body. The industry moved into this kind of interracial porn, I think, because if the sexual charge in pornography comes from seeing women humiliated, in a racist society, what better way to intensify the humiliation than to force white women to have sex with black men? I think that's the simple explanation. Right? And the industry recognizes this because white pornography performers, women who perform in pornography and are white, are aware that if they do interracial scenes, right, it kind of taints them forever. Their purity is, going to be affected, and the ability to command higher wages will be affected. Right? Because white women who have sex with black men are typically paid less. Right? That's the contemporary pornography world. Right? Now, what are we going to do about this? Well, I'm not going to talk about public policy. I'm not going to talk about the law. There's a lot of traditional law that has been obviously ineffective at dealing with this. There have been some ideas out of the feminist community for how to change public policy. It's a long debate, but we are so far in this country right now from dealing with the law on this when we're still struggling to come to terms with what it means. That since Andrea Dworkin wrote that book in the late 70s, right, the amount of pornography has expanded dramatically. The ease of access has expanded dramatically. And the intensity of the cruelty and degradation of women and the intensity of the racism in pornography has expanded dramatically at the same time. This creates what I call the paradox of pornography. Right? In a civilized society, as a media genre becomes more mainstream, and I'm not saying porn is mainstream like a Hollywood movie. Right? It's still considered on the margin in some sense. But porn is more mainstream than ever. It's more accepted than ever. It's more readily available than ever. And mainstream culture is more pornographic than ever. If you look at Hollywood movies, you'll see that they are much more pornographic in some senses than movies in the past. So pornography has become more mainstream. At the exact same time that the images routinely presented in pornography are more overtly cruel and degrading to women and more overtly racist. You would not think that as a media genre became more accepted and more popular, it would become more racist and sexist, yes? In a civilized society. In a civilized society, you would think those two lines would diverge, that if a media genre intensified its racism, sexism, it would be rejected. In fact, it's been more accepted. So how do we resolve the paradox of pornography? Well, I think it's like most paradoxes. You have to look closely at the language. I said in a civilized society, yes? In a civilized society, you would not predict these two lines going together. And I think what the feminist anti-pornography movement has been asking the country and the culture, and in some sense the world, since pornography is now worldwide, to consider is whether or not this material is consistent with living in a civilized society. It asks us to really confront how deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life patriarchy and white supremacy are. Right? That this material becomes commonplace. Right? That, again, I'm not saying it's embraced by everyone, and I'm not saying there still aren't laws that can be brought to bear to criminalize some of this. But in general, this is a more deeply pornographic society than ever. Right? We have an analysis that helps us understand why, and that analysis is more marginal than ever. Right? Let's go back to Me Too. Why did I start off by talking about the Me Too movement? Because I think if the Me Too movement wants to deal honestly with the problem of men's violence against women, harassment, and that whole range of behaviors that I labeled sexual intrusion, we can't do it by ignoring other parts of the culture that are constantly reinforcing men's sense of entitlement to women's bodies, and especially a media genre in which that entitlement is presented in a way that deepens the domination-subordination dynamic that we allegedly want to struggle against. Right? Now, this is where I search for the upbeat ending. Yeah, no upbeat ending. Right? Everybody knows when you're a speaker, if you're going to lay out, something harsh about the world, you've got to have an upbeat ending, right? Because otherwise you leave people depressed. I have no upbeat ending. I offer no upbeat ending. I want you to be depressed. I've been depressed for 30 damn years about this. Why should I be alone? I need some company. Now, the reason I'm not going to offer an upbeat ending is twofold. One is that I already hinted that I don't think now is the time to talk about public policy and the law. We're so far from being able to cope with this that to start talking about law is, from my point of view, premature. But the other reason I don't want to provide an upbeat ending is because we have to sit with the discomfort of this. Right? it is uncomfortable. And the reason it's uncomfortable is not simply it's an uncomfortable intellectual enterprise. This is uncomfortable personally, because unless I'm mistaken, or unless Sam Houston State is distinctly different than every other place in this country, this is a deeply personal question, because those of us in the room have some connection to this. Right? For those of us who are men, virtually all of us at some point in our life have used pornography. Some in the room are probably using pornography still. Women also use pornography, but women's connection to pornography also is often through male partners and the tension that can arise over that use. And there are women in the room who struggle with that. So I want to acknowledge that this is not, simply an abstract intellectual question about some world over there. It's very much about our world and our lives, which is why it is so difficult. But I think we all know that you don't solve difficult problems by avoiding them. And so I offer no upbeat ending in part because I would encourage people to sit with that sense of discomfort, because I have been sitting with it a long time. It doesn't magically go away when you read the feminist analysis and start to get a grip on how this operates. But I would offer the feminist analysis as a way to start dealing with that discomfort. I said that my books are, I think useful in addressing this. The recent book is called The End of Patriarchy. I always point out that's aspirational, not a prediction. We would like to see the end of patriarchy. I'm not saying it's coming anytime soon. About 10 years ago, I wrote a book called Getting Off: Pornography and the End of Masculinity. There's at least one copy in the room, I know. That book is out. There's good news and bad news about that book. The bad news is it's out of print. The company went bankrupt that published it, not because of the book. It went bankrupt because of bad management. It wasn't my fault. The good news is once they went bankrupt, I realized I could put a PDF of the book up online for free. So at my website, you can search and you can find that text as well. But again, I want to end here. I want to emphasize that my books would not be the first place I would recommend. I would recommend two books. One is the new collection of Andrea Dworkin's work, which puts back into print some work that had gone out of print and includes some unpublished writing. The book has a title that I'm from North Dakota, and we're very shy people. This is all very difficult for me to talk about. But the book is called Last Days at Hot Slit. Very uncomfortable to say in front of a group, but and the title of that collection echoes an unused title Andrea had for one of her books. But if you want an introduction to Andrea's work, this book just came out. It's widely available in paperback, and it's really compelling. The introduction sets Andrea in this historical moment as well. And so I would recommend that you start with Andrea Dworkin. From there, I would go to my friend Gail Dines' book called Pornland: How Pornography Hijacked Our Sexuality, which is now about 7 or 8 years old, but still is the best account of how the industry works. Gail went deeply into a study of the porn industry and why the images we're talking about look the way they look. So Gail's work, Andrea's work, and if you want to start trying to figure out coping mechanisms, I would also recommend a group that Gail started called Culture Reframed. And especially for people who have children, Culture Reframed, the tagline for which is that pornography is the public health crisis of the digital age. Thinking about pornography and the use of it and its implications as a kind of public health problem. Right? Culture Reframed has produced a really excellent series on how parents can talk to their kids about this. Right? We know that parents generally are often awkward in talking about sex with children. I know from personal experience it's hard. Right? And talking about pornography can be especially difficult. So the Parents Program that's online at Culture Reframed might be a particularly useful resource for some of you. Because in the end, having all this critique is wonderful. It helps us understand why the world looks the way it is. But it's difficult to then navigate in that world, not only, and this is where I'll end, not only in talking to kids, but in talking to each other. And at lunch, I had a chance to speak to some really great sociology students, and I was reminded of how, for young women specifically, trying to navigate this world, this is a real issue. Whether you acknowledge it or not, it's either right up front in relationships, heterosexual relationships, or it's often lurking in the background. So uncomfortable, yes, but necessary to engage as well.